They say you always remember the exact moment your life splits in two. For me, it happened at 3:17 p.m. on a Thursday, on the 42nd floor of a Manhattan skyscraper, when a man in an Armani suit smiled and tore my future in half. The sound of paper ripping wasn't loud, but in that executive conference room, it echoed like a gunshot. And as the torn pieces drifted down onto the polished mahogany table, I understood something with absolute clarity. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It was an execution. My name is Madeline Brooks, and this is the story of how I learned that in corporate America, respect is never handed to you. It's taken, usually after someone tries very hard to take it from you first. The executive conference room had always felt untouchable. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the Manhattan skyline like a living mural. The table could seat 20, carved from dark mahogany so glossy you could see your reflection if you leaned close enough. That afternoon, every seat was filled except one. Mine. I was the youngest person in the room by at least 10 years, the only woman, and the only one who had actually built something before arriving there. The men around the table sat with practiced ease, tablets aligned, leather chairs creaking softly as they shifted. No one spoke above a murmur. They all knew what was about to happen. Douglas Harlan stood at the head of the table, perfectly composed. Salt and pepper hair. Tailored suit. The kind of CEO who had mastered the art of sounding reasonable while doing unreasonable things. He glanced at his watch, then smiled in my direction. Before we wrap up, he said, voice smooth and amplified by years of boardroom dominance, I believe Madeline is expecting something. My spine straightened instinctively. After 12 months of rebuilding the engineering division from the ground up, after delivering growth numbers so strong they'd forced even the CFO to revise forecasts twice, this was supposed to be the moment. The restricted stock grant. 8 figures. The final piece that would make me more than just an employee. It would make me a stakeholder. His assistant entered carrying a single manila envelope. She placed it in front of me carefully, like it might explode if handled wrong. The room fell into that particular corporate silence where even breathing feels inappropriate. I picked it up. The envelope was thinner than expected, lighter. That should have been my first warning. Inside wasn't the 40-page agreement I'd reviewed months ago. Just a single sheet of paper. One paragraph. Carefully worded. Bloodless. It stated that any prior verbal or informal agreements regarding equity compensation had been superseded by current restructuring initiatives. That was it. No numbers. No vesting schedule. No grant. I don't understand, I said, though a part of me already did. Douglas stepped closer. His smile never reached his eyes. He took the envelope from my hands and, without hesitation, tore it cleanly in half. This grant, he said casually, letting the pieces fall, you'll never see a dime. The paper landed on the table like dead leaves. No one moved. No one spoke. I looked around the room, searching for a single ally. The CFO suddenly became fascinated with his phone. Legal counsel stared out the window as if the skyline had just revealed a secret. Not one of them met my eyes. You see, Madeline, Douglas continued, returning to his seat, when we acquired your startup, certain expectations were discussed. But promises and contracts are not the same thing. And what you believed was promised was never formally approved. Informal? The word slipped out sharper than intended. I have emails. Term sheets. Performance benchmarks you personally signed off on. Douglas raised his eyebrows, amused. Do you? Because our records indicate everything was contingent on board approval. And, he gestured lazily around the table, consider this your notice of non-approval. The humiliation was deliberate. This could have been a private meeting. A quiet email. But that wasn't the goal. This was theater. A warning to everyone else in the room about who held power and who didn't. 14 months ago, I said evenly. You sat in my office in Boston and told me if I delivered 25% growth, the equity grant was guaranteed. I delivered 28. Douglas nodded, as if complimenting a child. Exceptional work. Your salary reflects that. My salary was never the deal. Deals change, he replied, shrugging. Welcome to the big leagues. This is a $16 billion corporation. Did you really think we'd give that kind of equity to someone who's barely been here a year? Barely been here a year. As if I hadn't built the technology they'd paid $300 million to acquire. As if I hadn't spent that year fixing systems that hadn't been updated since 2005. I closed my folder slowly. Is there anything else? I asked. Yes, Douglas said, smiling wider. Legal will be sending you an updated confidentiality agreement. Just to clear up any misunderstandings about past discussions. I stood, smoothed my skirt, and met his gaze. Of course. As I walked out, I heard him turn back to the room. Now, onto Q4 projections. The elevator ride down to my office took 43 seconds. In that time, I made 3 decisions. I would not cry. I would sign nothing. And Douglas Harlan had just made the worst mistake of his career. Inside my office, I closed the door and leaned against it for exactly 10 seconds. Then I opened the bottom drawer of my desk, the one with the false panel I'd installed my first week. Inside was a USB drive containing every acquisition email, every term sheet, every recorded call I'd ever thought might matter someday. Paranoia, it turns out, is just preparation wearing a bad reputation. As files loaded onto my screen, the pattern began to emerge. This wasn't personal. It was systematic. Emails from Douglas instructing legal to reinterpret acquisition obligations. Internal memos about minimizing legacy equity exposure. One message stopped me cold. The Brooks grant is our test case. If this works, we can apply the framework to the others. The others. By early evening, my phone started lighting up. Former founders. Former executives. Different companies. Same story. Promised equity. Delivered results. Denied compensation. Quietly. Privately. Efficiently. Douglas thought tearing up that envelope ended the conversation. What he didn't realize was that by humiliating me publicly, he'd done something he'd never done before. He'd created witnesses. And witnesses turned patterns into cases. That night, as Manhattan glittered outside my window, I opened a new document and typed a title that would change everything: Timeline of Acquisition Equity Fraud. I didn't know how far this would go yet. I only knew one thing for certain. The war he thought he'd won in that boardroom had just begun. And in the next part of this story, I'll tell you how I discovered I wasn't alone, how one torn envelope exposed a multi-million-dollar lie, and why by the end of that week, the 42nd floor would never belong to Douglas Harlan again. By the time the sun came up the next morning, I wasn't angry anymore. Anger burns fast and clouds judgment. What replaced it was colder, sharper, and far more dangerous. Clarity. I arrived at the office before 7, while the building still smelled like cleaning solution and silence. Early mornings in corporate towers feel like borrowed time, like you're moving through a place before it remembers who it belongs to. That morning, it belonged to me. I locked my office door, connected an encrypted external drive, and began making copies. Everything related to the acquisition. Every email. Every presentation. Every recorded meeting I had legitimate access to. I was careful, methodical. If anyone audited my activity, it would look like routine executive prep. Division heads review historical data all the time. Nothing suspicious about that. What would have been suspicious was doing nothing. As the files transferred, I replayed the past year in my head with new context. Douglas hadn't improvised in that boardroom. He'd rehearsed. The torn envelope wasn't emotion. It was strategy. A message. Don't fight. Don't ask questions. Take the loss and be grateful you're still here. The problem was, I'd never been good at following scripts written by other people. At 8:30, my assistant knocked, tension written across her face. "Legal is here," she said quietly. "They have documents." I smiled. "Send them in." The attorney handed me a thick folder, dense with language designed to exhaust rather than inform. Buried deep was the real purpose. By signing, I would acknowledge that all equity discussions had been non-binding, preliminary, and unenforceable. A retroactive eraser. Clean. Efficient. Illegal if proven in context. "I'll have my attorney review this," I said calmly. Her smile tightened. "Mr. Harlan was hoping to have this finalized today." I'm sure he was. After she left, my phone buzzed. A message from a former founder I barely knew. Then another. Then another. Different names. Different companies. Same pattern. Promises made during acquisition negotiations. Equity framed as part of total deal value. Performance delivered. Promises quietly voided once integration was complete. I wasn't a special case. I was just the first one he'd humiliated publicly. By noon, I had documented 14 similar cases. 14 people who'd built real value, then watched it evaporate behind closed doors. And suddenly, Douglas's confidence made sense. Individually, we were manageable. Isolated. Outlawyered. Together, we were something else entirely. That afternoon, I reviewed Kernan's most recent SEC filings. The numbers didn't lie, but they didn't tell the truth either. Acquisition costs reported to investors consistently excluded the promised equity grants shown in internal board decks. Millions in undisclosed liabilities. A gap that only existed if you assumed no one would ever connect the dots. That's when I made the call I'd been avoiding. A former colleague. Now a senior investigator at the SEC. I framed it as hypothetical. She didn't bother pretending. "If there's a pattern," she said, "this isn't an HR issue. This is securities fraud." That night, I met with the others in a quiet hotel conference room. No suits. No titles. Just founders and executives who'd learned the hard way how disposable they were once the ink dried. I laid out the evidence. The discrepancies. The pattern. The leverage. Silence followed. Then agreement. One by one, they committed their documentation. Emails. Contracts. Messages they'd been told to forget about. By midnight, we weren't a support group. We were a case. The rest unfolded faster than Douglas could control. The SEC moved quietly at first. Warrants don't announce themselves. They arrive with boxes and federal badges. By Monday morning, the 42nd floor was locked down. Investigators everywhere. Servers seized. Executives escorted to private rooms with questions they couldn't dodge. Douglas didn't call me. He didn't need to. His attorney did. An offer. More money than my original grant. Immediate payment. Silence in exchange. I asked for it in writing. Then forwarded it to federal prosecutors. Bribery looks worse on letterhead. When the board summoned me, the room felt different. Same table. Same skyline. No confidence. Just fear. I told them everything. Calmly. Precisely. I didn't accuse. I documented. The vote to place Douglas on administrative leave was unanimous. By the end of the day, the stock was in free fall and the press was circling. Douglas made one last mistake. He tried to destroy evidence after being locked out. He didn't know federal monitoring was already in place. Every deleted file became another charge. When the FBI walked into that boardroom 2 days later, he finally understood something I'd known since the envelope hit the table. Power only works until someone stops believing in it. The arrest was quiet. No speech. No drama. Just handcuffs and silence. When the board turned to me and asked if I would step in as interim CEO, I said yes. Not because I wanted the title. Because someone had to clean up what he'd broken. The months that followed were brutal. Lawsuits. Investigations. A collapsing stock price. People leaving. People confessing. But we honored every promise he'd erased. Every equity grant paid. Every record corrected. Trust rebuilt one uncomfortable truth at a time. A year later, I stood in that same room, at the same time of day, signing a document that transferred recovered equity into an employee fund. The envelope Douglas had torn sat framed on my desk, taped back together. Not as a trophy. As a reminder. Here's the truth no one tells you about corporate revenge. It isn't loud. It isn't fast. And it isn't about winning. It's about refusing to accept a lie just because it comes from someone powerful. Douglas thought business wasn't personal. He was wrong. When someone steals your work, your future, and your voice, it's personal enough to fight back. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever been promised something that vanished the moment it became inconvenient, I'd love to hear your experience. Share it in the comments. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more true inspired stories about power, justice, and standing your ground. And remember, sometimes the moment they think they've won is the moment everything starts to fall apart.